Clara pressed her back against the wall of the narrow corridor behind her father's old study and held her breath. She had come here to escape the noise, the servants rushing through the halls with armfuls of white lilies, the dressmakers arguing over her train, the string quartet warming up in the chapel below. In less than an hour, she would walk down the aisle and marry Duke Marcus Ashford, one of the wealthiest men along the entire southern coast of England. She had accepted this marriage because she had no other choice. 2 years ago, her father's merchant fleet, 7 proud vessels that had sailed the East Indies routes for 3 generations, had been destroyed. One by one, they were lost. The Amelia Rose was taken by pirates off the coast of Ceylon. The Hartfield struck a reef near Mauritius that had never appeared on any chart before. The Kingfisher vanished somewhere in the Strait of Malacca and was never seen again. Within 18 months, everything her family had built over a century was gone. Her father had aged 20 years in that time. His health broke, his credit dried up. The family estate in Devon was mortgaged twice over. And when Duke Marcus Ashford rode up to their crumbling manor house in his polished black carriage and offered a solution, "Marry me, and your father's debts disappear," Clara had looked at her father's trembling hands and said yes. She had told herself it could be worse. Marcus was handsome enough, well-spoken, respected in society. He owned a shipping empire of his own, a grand estate at Crestwood Manor overlooking the sea, and a seat in the county's highest circles. Perhaps, she thought, she could learn to be content, perhaps even happy, given enough time. That was before she heard his voice drifting through the study door. "Every last vessel," Marcus was saying. His tone was light, almost amused, the way a man might talk about a hand of cards he had played particularly well. The pirates off Ceylon were the easiest arrangement. £200 to a smuggler captain named Hatch, and the Amelia Rose was at the bottom of the ocean before the season turned. Clara's hand found the wall, her fingers pressed into the cold plaster until her knuckles turned white. A second voice answered, thin and careful, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who made his living from documents and fine print. She recognized it as Mr. Pemberton, Marcus's private solicitor from London, a man with spectacles so thick they made his eyes look like a fish on a plate. "And the reef charts, Your Grace? I trust those have been properly disposed of." "Burned last Tuesday," Marcus said. "The false charts we planted with the Harbour Office in Mauritius have already been accepted as genuine. There is no record, Pemberton. There never was. As far as the Admiralty is concerned, the Ashford fleet simply had a terrible run of misfortune." "The Ashford fleet," Pemberton repeated, and Clara could hear the careful smile in his voice. "You mean the Thornton fleet, Your Grace?" "It was the Thornton fleet," Marcus corrected, and now there was a sharpness beneath his easy charm. "Past tense. What matters now is that old Thornton's East Indies trade charters come into my possession the moment I sign the marriage registry this morning. 3 generations of exclusive trading rights along the spice routes. Do you have any idea what those charters are worth on the open market, Pemberton?" "A fortune, Your Grace." "Several fortunes, and all it cost me was a few bribes, some doctored charts, and a wedding ring." Clara's legs felt like they might give way. She pressed both palms flat against the wall and forced herself to breathe. Slow, silent, measured. Every instinct told her to throw open that door and scream the truth into his smug, handsome face, to claw at him, to run to her father and tell him everything. She did none of those things, because even as the fury rose through her chest like a wave of boiling water, a colder, sharper part of her mind was already working, already calculating, already seeing the shape of something that Marcus, in all his arrogance, had never once considered. He thought she was a desperate girl with no options, a pawn he had trapped in a corner. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Clara straightened her spine. She smoothed the front of her ivory silk wedding gown, hand-stitched by a dressmaker in Bath, paid for with Marcus's own money, and walked away from the study door, without making a sound. The chapel at Crestwood Manor was filled with the golden light of a June morning. 200 guests filled the polished oak pews, lords and ladies from 3 counties, merchants, bankers, officers in dress uniform. White roses spilled from every surface. The string quartet played Handel as Clara appeared at the top of the aisle on her father's arm. Her father looked up at her with watery eyes. His hand trembled against her glove. "You look beautiful, my dear," he whispered. "Your mother would have been so proud." Clara kissed his cheek and said nothing about what she had heard. She walked down the aisle with her chin high and her expression serene. Every guest who watched her that morning would later say the same thing. They had never seen a more composed, more radiant bride. She smiled at Marcus as he took her hand at the altar. She repeated her vows in a voice as clear and steady as a church bell. And Marcus, looking down at her with that easy, confident smile of his, saw exactly what he expected to see. A grateful young woman who believed her new husband had saved her family from ruin. The ceremony concluded. The vicar closed his prayer book. The registry was brought forward on a velvet-draped table, and the guests applauded politely as Marcus signed his name with a flourish of his gold-tipped pen. Then it was Clara's turn. She leaned over the registry, and as she signed her name in her careful, elegant hand, she let her left arm brush against the table's edge. The movement was so small, so perfectly natural, that no one noticed. Her fingers found the worn leather case tucked inside the folds of the registry cloth. Her father's old trade seal, the one bearing the Thornton crest, which the vicar's clerk had set beside the documents as a formality. She slipped it into her silk reticule and closed the clasp with a soft click that was swallowed entirely by the sound of 200 guests rising to their feet in applause. Marcus offered her his arm. Clara took it. "Shall we greet our guests, Lady Ashford?" he said, his voice warm with triumph. Clara looked up at him, and she smiled. A perfect, beautiful, devastating smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Of course, my lord," she said. "I would not miss a moment of this day for anything in the world." And as they walked together through the chapel doors and into the sunlight, Clara held her husband's arm and began, very quietly, to plan his complete and utter destruction. The wedding breakfast lasted 4 hours. Clara smiled through every course, laughed at the toasts, danced the first waltz while 200 guests whispered about what a lucky girl she was. By the time the last carriage pulled away from Crestwood Manor and the servants began clearing the lawn, her face ached from smiling. Marcus helped her into their private carriage just as the sun began dropping toward the sea. The coach was lacquered black with gold trim and the Ashford crest painted on the door, a stag standing over a pair of crossed anchors. The interior smelled of polished leather and the faint sweetness of Marcus's cologne, something imported from Paris that he wore every single day without exception. "Port Royal by midnight," Marcus told the driver, tapping the roof twice with his walking stick. "And take the coastal road. I want my wife to see the harbor as we come down the hill." The carriage lurched forward, and the gravel of Crestwood's long drive crunched beneath the wheels. Clara settled into the velvet seat across from Marcus and arranged her traveling cloak over her lap. Through the window, the estate shrank behind them, the pale stone walls, the chapel spire, the rose gardens where she had stood that morning and made her decision. "You were magnificent today," Marcus said. He stretched his legs out and crossed his boots at the ankle. "Every woman in that room envied you. I could see it in their faces." "You are too kind, my lord." "I am never kind without reason." He smiled at her, that wide, easy smile that she now understood was the same expression a cat wore while watching a trapped mouse. "Tomorrow morning we board the Iron Sovereign, 3 weeks along the coast, stopping at every port of consequence between here and the capital. I want every harbor master, every merchant, every shipping agent to see my bride and know that the Ashford name now commands the East Indies routes." Clara tilted her head as though this fascinated her. "You have partners along the route, then? Other men with interests in your trade?" "Several. Lord Caulfield in Portsmouth holds my southern cargo contracts. Sir William Drake manages insurance through Lloyd's, and the banking syndicate in London financed the Iron Sovereign herself." "A banking syndicate?" Clara repeated, letting innocent wonder creep into her voice. "How thrilling! Father always said I had a head for household accounts, but nothing grander." Marcus laughed. "Your father was a good man, Clara, but he understood very little about real commerce. The sums I manage on a single voyage would make his yearly income look like pocket change." Clara lowered her eyes and folded her hands in her lap, the perfect picture of a wife who knew her place. "I suppose you keep all your important papers aboard the ship? Ledgers and contracts and such things?" "Everything of consequence travels with me," Marcus said, tapping his leather briefcase beneath the seat with the toe of his boot. "Banking codes, cargo manifests, private correspondence. A man in my position cannot afford to leave such documents unattended in a house full of servants." "How wise," Clara murmured. The carriage rocked gently as the road curved along the cliff tops. Below them, the sea caught the last of the evening light and turned it into a ribbon of molten copper stretching toward the horizon. Marcus poured himself a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter mounted in the carriage wall and began talking about the ports they would visit, the people they would meet, the impression they would make. Clara listened to every word and stored each detail in a corner of her mind that Marcus would never know existed. After an hour, the brandy and the motion of the carriage did their work. Marcus's voice grew slower, his sentences wandering. His eyelids drooped. He set his glass in its holder, crossed his arms, and leaned his head against the padded wall. "Wake me when we reach the hill above the harbor," he murmured, and within minutes his breathing had settled into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. Clara waited. She counted 60 breaths, slow and even, before she moved. She reached beneath the seat and drew the leather briefcase onto her lap. The clasp was fitted with a small brass lock. Clara withdrew one of the long steel pins from her wedding curls. Her father had taught her how these mechanisms worked when she was a girl, letting her play with the old shipping cases in his office because it amused him to see his daughter curious about things most young ladies ignored entirely. The pin slid into the keyhole. She adjusted the angle and pressed. The lock clicked open with a sound no louder than a fingernail tapping glass. Inside the briefcase, she found exactly what Marcus had described: cargo manifests, insurance papers, private letters bearing wax seals she did not recognize. And there, folded inside a calfskin wallet, a single sheet of cream-colored paper printed with the heading of the London Continental Banking Syndicate. On it were written Marcus's private banking codes, his authorization signatures, and the account references for every financial arrangement tied to his fleet. Clara read the sheet twice, pressing each detail into her memory the way a jeweler studies the facets of a diamond before making a cut. Then she returned every document to its exact position, closed the briefcase, and locked it again with the pin. She slid the case back beneath the seat, replaced the pin in her hair, and smoothed her traveling cloak. When Marcus woke as the carriage crested the hill above Port Royal, he found his bride gazing out the window at the moonlit harbor below, her expression soft and dreamy. "There she is," he said, pointing past Clara's shoulder at the tall-masted ship anchored at the end of the longest pier. "The Iron Sovereign, the finest cutter on the southern coast." Clara leaned toward the glass and let her eyes widen. "She is beautiful, Marcus." "She is mine," he said. "And so, my dear, are you." Clara smiled and said nothing at all. The docks at Port Royal smelled of tar, salt, and fresh timber. Clara stood at the edge of the stone quay in the pale grey light of early morning and watched the harbor come alive. Fishermen hauled crates from their boats. Dock workers rolled barrels of rum along the wooden gangways. Gulls screamed overhead, diving between the masts of ships anchored along the waterfront. The Iron Sovereign sat at the far end of the longest pier, and she was everything Marcus had promised. A three-masted cutter with a black hull and brass fittings that caught the first rays of sunrise like scattered coins. Her sails were furled tight against the yards, and her deck gleamed with fresh varnish. 24 crewmen moved across her rigging with the practiced ease of men who had sailed together for years. Marcus stood 20 paces ahead, deep in conversation with a man she had never seen before. He was short and thin, dressed in a brown wool coat that hung loose on his narrow shoulders. He clutched a leather portfolio against his chest, the way a mother might hold an infant in a crowded street. Clara recognized the type immediately. Her father had employed men like this, men whose entire world existed inside columns of figures, whose happiness depended on every number landing in its proper place. This had to be Mr. Vance. She watched as Marcus produced a ring of iron keys from inside his coat and handed them to Vance with a few quiet words. Vance received them with both hands, turning each key over as though inspecting it for damage, then tucked the ring into his portfolio with such care that Clara half expected him to pat it twice for reassurance. Marcus clapped Vance on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look friendly, but landed with the weight of ownership, and then turned toward the ship, calling out to the boatswain about the condition of the forward rigging. Clara saw her opening. She gathered her skirts and walked along the pier toward Vance, keeping her pace unhurried, her expression pleasant. The morning breeze pulled at the ribbons of her bonnet and carried the smell of the open sea across the harbor.
"Mr. Vance,"
she said, stopping a few feet from him with a polite smile.
"I do hope I am not interrupting. I am Lady Ashford."
Vance looked up at her with the startled expression of a man who spent most of his life trying to avoid being noticed. "Your ladyship," he said, and gave a stiff little bow that bent him at the waist like a folding ruler. "A pleasure. My congratulations on your marriage."
"You are very kind. I was hoping you might help me with a small matter. My husband mentioned that I would have a private sea cabin aboard the ship, and I confess I know nothing about sailing arrangements. Would you happen to know where I might find the steward to discuss the details?"
Vance relaxed slightly. "The steward would be Mr. Crawley, your ladyship. You will find him below decks, through the aft companionway."
"How helpful you are, Mr. Vance. My husband speaks very highly of your work."
Something shifted behind Vance's eyes. A flicker of surprise, followed almost instantly by suspicion. Men like Vance were never praised. They were used, relied upon, and ignored. Praise from a duke's wife meant something was happening that he did not understand, and things he did not understand made him deeply uncomfortable. Clara let a small pause settle between them, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then she lowered her voice, as though sharing a confidence she probably should not.
"Between us, Mr. Vance, I believe my husband intends to review the fleet accounts personally before we reach the capital. He mentioned something about a thorough audit of the books, every entry, every transaction, going back several quarters."
She gave a little shake of her head, as though the idea exhausted her.
"I cannot imagine the work involved. You must be wonderfully organized to manage such a task."
The color drained from Vance's face so quickly, it was as though someone had pulled a plug beneath his collar. His fingers tightened around the leather portfolio until the knuckles went pale. "An audit," he repeated. His voice had gone flat and careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is trying very hard to sound calm. "His Grace has not mentioned this to me."
"Oh dear."
Clara pressed a gloved hand to her lips.
"Perhaps I was not meant to say anything. Please do forget I mentioned it, Mr. Vance. I would hate to cause any trouble."
She gave him another warm smile, turned on her heel, and walked toward the gangplank where 2 sailors waited to help her aboard.
Behind her, she could feel Vance standing perfectly still on the dock, his mind already racing through every ledger entry, every receipt he had ever filed or failed to file. She did not need to look back. She knew exactly what a man like Vance would do with this kind of fear. He would go to those books tonight and begin checking every page. He would find things to worry about, real or imagined, because men who lived inside numbers always did. And the more he worried, the wider the crack between him and Marcus would grow. Clara climbed the gangplank, stepped onto the deck of the Iron Sovereign, and paused. The harbor stretched out below, busy and bright in the morning sun. Somewhere in the hold, Marcus's locked chests sat heavy with the deeds to everything he had stolen from her family. Marcus appeared beside her at the railing, his coat unbuttoned, his face full of that easy confidence she had once mistaken for kindness. "Welcome aboard, Lady Ashford," he said, offering his arm. 3 weeks at sea. I trust you will find the voyage comfortable." Clara took his arm and looked out across the water. "I have a feeling," she said quietly, "that this voyage will be one neither of us forgets." 2 days at sea had taught Clara the rhythms of the Iron Sovereign, the way a musician learns the timing of a new orchestra. She knew that the night watch changed at 2 in the morning, and that for exactly 12 minutes during the handover, the corridor outside the captain's cabin went unpatrolled. She knew that Marcus drank port wine with his supper every evening and brandy after, and that by midnight his sleep was so heavy a cannon blast from the gun deck would barely make him turn over. She knew that the cabin boy left a fresh candle on the chart table at 10 o'clock each night and did not return until dawn. On the 3rd night, she put all of this knowledge to use. The celebratory dinner had been Marcus's idea. He had invited the ship's officers to dine in the great cabin, roasted duck, 3 bottles of claret, and a Stilton cheese he claimed had been aging since before the war with France. The officers laughed at his jokes, complimented his wine, and told him what a fine vessel he commanded. Clara sat at the far end of the table and played her part. She asked the first mate polite questions about navigation, and when Marcus raised his glass for the 4th toast, she watched him drain it and noted the way his eyes had begun to lose their sharpness. By the time the officers retired and Marcus stumbled into bed, he was asleep before his head found the pillow. Clara lay beside him in the dark, listening to the creak of the ship's timbers and the soft rush of the sea against the hull. She waited a full hour, counting the minutes by the slow swing of the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam. Then she moved. She slid out of bed and crossed the cabin floor in bare feet, stepping over the places where she knew the boards groaned. Marcus's coat hung on a brass hook beside the door. She reached into the inner pocket and found what she was looking for. A small iron key on a leather cord, warm from being pressed against his chest all evening. The captain's desk stood against the far wall beneath a row of mounted naval charts showing the coastal waters from Portsmouth to the capital. Clara had studied those charts during the day, tracing the routes with her finger, while Marcus believed she was simply admiring the illustrations. She had noticed that 2 of the charts were mounted on hinges rather than nailed flat, an odd detail for decorative maps, unless they were meant to be opened. She fitted the key into the lock hidden beneath the lower chart's frame. It turned with a soft, oiled click, and the chart swung outward on its brass hinges like the door of a small cupboard. Behind it sat a narrow shelf holding 3 leather-bound ledgers, each one thick with entries and marked on the spine with dates going back 4 years. Clara carried them to the chart table where the candle burned and opened the first one. The numbers told a story Marcus would have given anything to keep hidden. 4 years ago, he had approached the London Continental Banking Syndicate with a proposal, a massive loan to build the Iron Sovereign and expand his shipping routes. The interest rates were enormous, the kind that would ruin a man within 2 years if he missed payments, and the collateral he had pledged was listed in black ink on page 47. The Thornton East Indies Trade Charters. Clara's hand trembled as she read the entry. Marcus had pledged her family's trading rights as security for his debts before he had even begun courting her, before the first pirate attack, before the first sabotaged reef chart. He had planned every step of her family's destruction years in advance, all to guarantee himself collateral he did not yet own. She turned through the remaining pages with steady hands, forcing the anger down into a place where it could be useful.
The second ledger confirmed what she had suspected from the banking codes in his briefcase. Marcus was already behind on his loan repayments. 3 quarterly installments had been deferred, each one carrying a penalty that compounded on the last. The syndicate had sent 2 formal warnings. A third default would trigger an automatic seizure clause, allowing the bank to claim every asset tied to the loan. Every asset, including the Iron Sovereign herself. Clara closed the ledger and sat very still for a moment, listening to Marcus's breathing from across the cabin. Deep, slow, undisturbed. The sleep of a man who believed he had won. From beneath the lining of her traveling trunk, she retrieved the documents she had prepared before the wedding. Legal transfer forms, drafted in the standard language of maritime commerce, the kind her father had taught her to read before she turned 15.
She had written them out in her own hand during the weeks before the ceremony, leaving only the signature line blank. Now she opened the first ledger again, found a clean example of Marcus's signature, and copied it onto the transfer forms with a careful, practiced hand. She had always been good at penmanship. Her governess used to say that Clara could forge the king's handwriting if she put her mind to it. The old woman had meant it as a joke. It took her 20 minutes to complete all 3 forms. She compared each signature against the original, checking every loop and flourish until she was satisfied. Then she returned the ledgers to their hidden shelf, locked the chart frame, replaced the key in Marcus's coat, and slipped the signed forms back into the lining of her trunk. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers to her chin. Beside her, Marcus shifted in his sleep and mumbled something she could not make out. Clara stared at the ceiling and listened to the ocean beneath them.
3 days married, and she held enough evidence to bring her husband's empire crashing down. All she needed now was the right moment to deliver it. The Iron Sovereign dropped anchor in Oakhaven Harbor just after noon on the 4th day. Clara stood at the deck railing and watched the town reveal itself through the clearing sea mist. Stone buildings stacked along a hillside, cobblestone streets winding down to a waterfront lined with oyster stalls and chandlery shops, with painted signs swinging in the breeze. Marcus was in high spirits as they came ashore. He walked Clara along the harbor wall with his arm through hers, pointing out the quality of the stone quays and the depth of the anchorage, as though he had built them himself. When they reached the high street, he steered her toward a handsome brick tavern called the Compass Rose, where a private dining room had been prepared on the first floor.
"The finest kitchen between Portsmouth and London," Marcus announced, pulling out Clara's chair with a flourish. "The landlord cures his own ham and keeps a cellar that would put half the clubs in St. James's to shame." Within minutes, 2 local merchants arrived at the table, men with weathered faces and ink-stained fingers who clearly owed Marcus money, or favors, or both. They fell into a conversation about cargo prices, insurance rates, and the cost of Baltic timber that made Clara's eyes glaze over by design. She had no interest in their talk. She had interest in their timing. She waited until Marcus was deep in a disagreement about the price of Swedish pine, his back half turned toward her, his voice rising with the particular energy of a man who enjoyed winning arguments more than he enjoyed being right. Then she pressed a hand to her forehead and let out a small, careful breath. "Marcus," she said softly, "I am feeling rather faint. The heat of the room, I think. Would you mind terribly if I rested in one of the parlors downstairs for a short while?"
Marcus glanced at her with the mild concern of a man who did not want his dinner interrupted. "Of course, my dear. I will send for you when we are ready to return to the ship." Clara thanked him, excused herself from the merchants, and left the dining room. She descended the narrow staircase and crossed the tavern's ground floor, passing through the busy public bar where dock workers sat over pints of ale and plates of bread and cheese. At the back of the building,
A corridor led to 3 small private parlors used by travelers who wanted a quiet place to write letters or conduct business away from the noise. Clara entered the last parlor and closed the door behind her. A man was already waiting inside. He stood by the window with his hat in his hands, tall, gray-haired, in a plain dark coat, with the kind of face that blended into a crowd the way a sparrow disappears against a stone wall. His name was Mr. Aldridge, and for 23 years he had served as her father's head clerk in Bristol, managing every contract and charter that passed through the Thornton shipping office. When the business collapsed, Aldridge had been the last man to leave. He had packed the ledgers into crates with his own hands and posted the office key back through the letterbox with a note that read, "When you need me, sir, you know where I am." Clara had written to him 4 days before the wedding. "Mr. Aldrich," she said.
He gave a short bow. "Lady Ashford." The name clearly tasted wrong in his mouth, but he was too well-mannered to say so. "I rode through the night from Bristol. Your letter said the matter was urgent."
"It is."
Clara reached into the inner pocket of her traveling cloak and produced the folded transfer forms she had prepared in the captain's cabin.
"These documents prove that Duke Marcus used high-interest loans from the London Continental Banking Syndicate to build his flagship. The collateral he pledged against those loans was my father's East Indies trade charters he did not own at the time of signing and obtained through deliberate destruction of our fleet."
Aldridge took the papers and read them with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had spent his life examining documents for errors. His expression did not change, but Clara noticed his jaw tighten as he reached the second page.
"He has also missed 3 quarterly repayments," Clara continued. "A 3rd formal default triggers an automatic seizure clause in the syndicate's lending terms. These transfer forms, bearing his own signature, prove that he fraudulently pledged assets he had no legal right to mortgage. If the syndicate receives them before we reach the capital, they will have grounds to begin immediate enforcement proceedings." Aldridge folded the papers and placed them inside his coat. "The syndicate's offices are on Threadneedle Street. I can be in London by tomorrow evening if I ride through the night and take the morning mail coach from Reading." "Then go tonight," Clara said. "And Mr. Aldridge, my father must not know. He would try to stop me, and I cannot afford his kindness right now." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his careful grey eyes. She had known this man since she years. He had carried her on his shoulders through the Bristol dockyard. He had taught her how to read a cargo manifest before she learned to dance. "Your father," he said quietly, "would be prouder of you than he has ever been of anyone." He put on his hat, tucked the documents against his chest, and left through the parlor's back entrance without another word. Clara returned to the dining room 12 minutes later. Marcus was still arguing about timber. He barely looked up when she sat down. "Feeling better, my dear?" "Much better," Clara said, and reached for her glass of water. "The fresh air did me a world of good." The storm arrived without warning on the 5th night. A wall of black cloud rolled in from the west and swallowed the horizon whole. The wind shifted so fast that the boatswain barely had time to shout before the first wave broke across the bow and sent cold water flooding down the deck. The crew scrambled to reef the sails. Lanterns swung wildly. Ropes snapped tight with sounds like pistol shots. The ship turned hard to starboard and made for a sheltered cove near St. Jude's Reef, where a ring of jagged rocks broke the worst of the sea. Clara braced herself against the walls of the captain's cabin as the ship rolled beneath her. Through the cabin window, she could see nothing except spray and darkness and the occasional flash of lightning that turned the ocean white for half a second before vanishing again. Marcus had gone up on deck the moment the storm hit, shouting orders at the crew with the authority of a man who owned a ship rather than knew how to sail one. The boatswain and the first mate did the real work. Marcus stood at the quarterdeck rail and got in the way, which suited Clara perfectly. She had laid the groundwork carefully. On the night she copied Marcus's signatures in the captain's cabin, she had made 3 small alterations to the hidden ledgers before returning them to their shelf. A transposed figure on page 12,
a missing entry on page 31, a date that did not match its corresponding receipt on page 44. Each one was tiny, the kind of error that an honest bookkeeper might make on a tired evening and correct the next morning. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, to a man already consumed by the fear of an impending audit, they would look like evidence of something far worse. And tonight, with the ship pitching in a storm and the crew occupied above decks, Mr. Vance had finally gone looking. Clara heard the argument before she saw it. Vance's voice came first, high, tight, almost cracking with the strain of a man who had spent 3 days terrifying himself with imaginary catastrophes and had now found proof that his worst fears were real.
These figures do not balance, Your Grace. Page 12 contradicts the harbor receipts from March. Page 31 is missing an entire cargo transfer, and the date on the Mauritius insurance claim does not match the policy I filed in London. Marcus's voice came back sharp and cold, cutting through the groan of the ship's timbers. "Are you accusing me of falsifying my own books, Vance?" "I am telling you that someone has been in these ledgers, Your Grace. Someone has altered entries. If the syndicate were to see these discrepancies during an audit—" "There is no audit!" Marcus's voice rose loud enough for Clara to hear every word through the cabin wall. "Who told you there was an audit?" A pause. Then Vance, quieter now, uncertain. I was given to understand." "By whom?" Silence. Clara could package Vance standing in the chart room, clutching his portfolio, realizing that he could not answer that question without admitting he had taken financial gossip from the Duke's own wife on a public dock. She could almost feel his panic spreading through the walls like heat from a fire. The argument continued, growing louder with each exchange. Marcus accused Vance of incompetence. Vance insisted the numbers had been tampered with. Their voices tangled together in the narrow corridor between the chart room and the main cabin, each man too angry to notice that the rest of the ship had gone quiet around them. Clara moved quickly. She crossed the cabin to Marcus's bedchamber, where his personal effects were arranged on the nightstand beside the bunk. His pocket watch, his reading spectacles, a crystal tumbler still holding the dregs of his evening brandy. And there, resting on a small velvet tray, was the thing she had come for. The ducal seal ring. It was heavy, a thick band of gold set with a carved carnelian stone bearing the Ashford crest. Marcus wore it during the day and removed it each night, placing it on the tray with the careful attention of a man who understood that this ring carried more legal authority than any document he could sign. A foreclosure notice stamped with it was as binding as a judge's order. Clara slipped the ring into the pocket of her dressing gown. Then she returned to the main cabin, sat at the writing desk, and retrieved the final set of documents from her traveling trunk. 3 foreclosure notices she had drafted during the long hours of the second day at sea, when Marcus believed she was writing letters to her cousins in Bath. She pressed the seal ring into the small block of red wax she had taken from the ship's correspondence kit. The Ashford crest sank into the wax with a clean, deep impression. She stamped each notice, blew the wax dry, and folded them into her reticule. The ring went back on the velvet tray before the argument in the chart room had finished. When Marcus finally returned to the cabin, his face was flushed and his jaw was tight with fury. Clara was sitting up in bed with a shawl around her shoulders and a look of gentle concern on her face. "Is everything all right, my lord? I heard raised voices." Marcus pulled off his boots and threw them against the wall. "Vance is a fool. I should have dismissed him months ago." Clara reached out and touched his arm. "Come to bed, Marcus. The storm will pass by morning." He climbed in beside her and was asleep within 10 minutes. Clara lay in the dark and listened to the wind dying over St. Jude's Reef. Every piece was almost in place now. 2 days remained. Morning came gray and still. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean and left the sea flat as a mill pond. The Iron Sovereign sat at anchor in a wide bay with the capital city's church spires visible on the distant shore,
like needles pushed into the horizon. Marcus was up before dawn. Clara heard him pacing the cabin floor, pulling on his boots, barking orders through the door at the steward about breakfast and hot water and whether the courier boat was ready. The argument with Vance had left a mark on him. His charm had a crack in it now, and underneath, Clara could see something harder. The impatience of a man who needed things to go according to plan and was beginning to feel the edges of his control fraying. He dressed quickly and came to stand beside the bunk where Clara lay with the blankets pulled to her chin. "We anchor at the capital tomorrow morning," he said. "I am sending a courier ashore to confirm arrangements with my solicitors. Stay aboard and rest. You look tired." Clara murmured something agreeable and closed her eyes. She listened to his footsteps cross the cabin and climbed the companionway ladder to the upper deck. Then she counted to 60, got out of bed, and dressed herself in the plain gray traveling dress she had packed at the bottom of her trunk, the one without lace or ribbon, the kind of dress a woman wore when she did not want to be remembered. On deck, the morning air was sharp with salt and the smell of wet timber drying in the early sun. The crew moved about their work with the tired efficiency of men who had spent a rough night fighting the weather. Clara kept close to the deckhouse and watched. Marcus stood near the bow, speaking with a young man in a brown coat and tall boots, the courier. He was barely 20, with the lean, hungry look of someone who rode fast for a living and spent whatever he earned before the next job came along. Marcus handed him a sealed letter and a small purse of coins. The courier tucked both inside his coat, touched his cap, and turned toward the ship's rail where a rowing boat waited to take him ashore. Clara stepped into his path. "Excuse me," she said, with the polite, slightly breathless manner of a woman who had hurried up from below decks. "Are you the courier my husband has engaged?" The young man stopped and pulled off his cap. "Yes, ma'am. Ride into the capital this morning." Clara glanced over her shoulder toward the bow. Marcus had already turned away and was speaking with the first mate about the morning tide. She had perhaps 2 minutes before he looked back. "My husband asked me to give you something additional," she said, keeping her voice low. She reached into her cloak and produced a small velvet pouch. Inside were 2 gold brooches and a pearl earring from her wedding trousseau, pieces Marcus had given her and would never notice missing. "A bonus for the urgency of the ride. The roads will be difficult after the storm." The courier's eyes widened as he felt the weight of the pouch. This was more than he would earn in 3 months. His fingers closed around it with the speed of a man who understood that generosity from wealthy people always came with conditions. "That is very kind of His Grace," the courier said carefully. "Is there anything else?" "There is one small thing." Clara produced a second sealed letter from inside her cloak. The seal was red wax, pressed with a crest the courier would not recognize, the Thornton merchant seal, taken from the registry table on her wedding day. "My husband also needs this letter delivered. It is to go to the High Court Marshal's office on Chancery Lane. The matter is urgent and confidential. He did not mention it to you on deck because he did not wish the crew to overhear." She paused and held the courier's gaze with the calm, direct look of a woman who expected to be obeyed. "You will deliver this letter first, before the one my husband gave you. The Marshal's office opens at 8 o'clock. Can you reach the capital by then?" The courier looked at the letter, then at the velvet pouch in his other hand, then back at Clara. Whatever doubts he might have had were buried under the weight of gold and pearls pressing against his palm. "I can ride it in 4 hours if I change horses at Whitchurch, ma'am." "Then change horses at Whitchurch." Clara placed the letter in his hand and stepped back. "And please, not a word to anyone aboard this ship. My husband values discretion above all things." The courier touched his cap again, climbed over the rail, and dropped into the rowing boat below. Clara watched as the 2 oarsmen pulled away from the ship and headed for the stone landing at the mouth of the bay, where a saddled horse was already waiting on the shore road. The letter she had given him was 3 pages long, a formal petition to the High Court Marshals requesting immediate enforcement of debt collection against Duke Marcus Ashford, supported by evidence of fraudulent asset pledges and violation of lending terms. Attached were the foreclosure notices bearing Marcus's own ducal seal.
By the time the courier reached London, the marshals would already be preparing their warrants.
Clara returned below decks, changed back into her morning dress, and appeared in the dining cabin just as Marcus sat down to his breakfast. He looked up and pushed a plate of toast toward her. "Sleep well?" "Very well," Clara said. She spread butter on a piece of toast and took a small, measured bite. "I dreamed about arriving at the capital. I have a feeling tomorrow will be a day to remember." Marcus smiled and poured himself a cup of tea. "That it will, my dear, that it will." The capital harbour was enormous. Stone quays stretched in every direction, lined with warehouses and customs houses and iron cranes swinging cargo nets from ship to shore. Hundreds of vessels crowded the basin, their masts rising like a leafless forest against the pale morning sky. The Iron Sovereign came in on the morning tide, her black hull cutting through the flat grey water of the outer channel as the pilot boat guided her toward a berth at the far end of the main commercial wharf. Marcus stood at the bow in his finest coat, dark blue wool with brass buttons and a silk cravat pinned with a diamond, looking every inch the wealthy duke arriving to conduct important business. Clara stood beside him in a dove-grey dress with a high collar and a bonnet trimmed with white ribbon. She carried her reticule in both hands, close against her waist. Her expression was pleasant and calm, the face of a woman enjoying the scenery on a fine morning. If her heart was hammering beneath the whalebone stays of her corset, no one aboard that ship could have guessed it. Marcus had spent the final day of the voyage in restless excitement. He had changed his coat 3 times and rehearsed his arrival speech to the mirror in the captain's cabin. Today was the day he would walk into the capital's maritime courts and formally register the Thornton East Indies trade charters under the Ashford name. The complete absorption of everything Clara's family had ever owned. "There," Marcus said, pointing toward the wharf as the ship's ropes were thrown to the dockhands below. "You see those gentlemen waiting at the end of the pier? That will be Pemberton and his associates from the law chambers. I sent word ahead from Oakhaven." Clara looked where he pointed. There were indeed men waiting at the end of the pier, quite a few of them in fact, more than a solicitor's party would normally require. "There seem to be rather a lot of gentlemen, Marcus," she said lightly. Marcus squinted against the morning glare and adjusted his cravat. "Pemberton probably brought his clerks. The man never travels without an army of paper pushers." The gangplank was lowered. Marcus offered Clara his arm with a broad smile and led her down the wooden ramp toward the stone quay. His boots struck the dock with the confident rhythm of a man who believed the entire harbour existed to receive him. They had taken perhaps 20 steps along the pier when the group of men at the end began walking toward them. The first thing Clara noticed was their coats. They were not the black frock coats of solicitors or the grey wool of legal clerks. They were dark red, the deep, unmistakable crimson of the High Court Marshal's office, with silver badges pinned above the left breast pocket. There were 6 of them, walking in formation, their faces set with the careful blankness of men who carried out unpleasant duties for a living. Behind the marshals came 3 more men in expensive tailored suits, each one carrying a leather document case. Clara recognized the style. London bankers, the kind who worked from offices on Threadneedle Street and spoke in figures the way poets spoke in verse. Marcus stopped walking. His arms stiffened under Clara's hand. "What is this?" he said. His voice was still confident, but there was a hairline fracture running through it now, like the first crack in a frozen pond. The lead marshal stepped forward and removed his hat. He was a broad man with a grey moustache and the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had delivered bad news to powerful men many times before and had stopped being impressed by their titles long ago. "Duke Marcus Ashford? I am. I am Senior Marshal Harding of the High Court Enforcement Office. I hold a warrant of immediate asset seizure issued this morning by the Lord Chancellor's Court on petition from the London Continental Banking Syndicate." He produced a folded document from inside his coat and held it out. "You are hereby served." Marcus did not take the document. He stared at it, as though it were a living thing that might bite him.
"This is absurd," he said. "There must be some mistake. My accounts with the syndicate are in perfect order." One of the bankers stepped forward, a tall, thin man with silver spectacles and a mouth that looked as though it had never smiled in its life.
"I am Mr. Hargreaves, Senior Director of the London Continental Banking Syndicate's Enforcement Division. There is no mistake, Your Grace."
He opened his document case and produced a thick sheaf of papers.
3 days ago, our offices received documented evidence that you pledged fraudulent collateral against your primary construction loan, specifically trade charters belonging to the Thornton merchant family, which you did not legally possess at the time of signing, and which were obtained through criminal interference with their commercial operations.
Marcus's face went white. The color drained from his cheeks so completely that for a moment he looked like a man carved from candle wax.
"Furthermore," Hargreaves continued, his voice as dry and precise as a clockwork mechanism, "you have defaulted on 3 consecutive quarterly repayments, triggering the automatic seizure clause in your lending agreement. As of this morning, the syndicate has exercised its contractual right to claim all assets tied to the loan." He gestured toward the Iron Sovereign floating behind them at her berth. "That includes this vessel and every other ship registered under the Ashford trading name." Marcus turned to Clara. His eyes were wide, searching her face for some anchor of understanding in a world that had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. Clara looked back at him with an expression of perfect, innocent confusion.
"Marcus," she said softly, "what is happening?"
He did not answer. He turned back to the marshal and opened his mouth, and for the first time since Clara had known him, Duke Marcus Ashford had absolutely nothing to say. The harbour master's office sat at the head of the commercial wharf, a solid building of Portland stone with tall windows and a brass plaque above the door that read, "Office of Maritime Commerce, established 1743. It was here that Senior Marshal Harding escorted Duke Marcus Ashford shortly before noon, with Clara walking 3 paces behind. The room they entered was large and formal, with oak-panelled walls and a long table covered in green baize. Portraits of former harbour masters hung in gilt frames between the windows. A clerk sat in the corner with a quill and an open ledger, recording everything. Marcus had recovered enough composure during the walk from the pier to find his voice again. He stood at the head of the table, with his hands flat on the green cloth, and addressed the room the way he addressed every room, as though he owned it. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "Whatever documents you have received, whatever claims the syndicate has made, they are based on incomplete information. I have the means to settle any outstanding obligations immediately." Mr. Hargreaves, the syndicate director, sat at the opposite end of the table with his document case open and his spectacles balanced on the tip of his nose. "With what means, Your Grace? Your fleet has been seized. Your construction loans are in default. Your trading accounts have been frozen pending investigation." Marcus straightened his shoulders. "With my wife's assets. As her husband, I hold legal authority over all property she brought into the marriage. The Thornton trade charters, the Devon estate, the dry dock holdings, all of it falls under marital right. I will pledge those assets against the debt and settle this matter today." He said it with such absolute certainty that for a moment the room went quiet. The clerk's quill stopped moving. Hargreaves looked up from his papers. Even Marshal Harding shifted his weight, as though preparing for the possibility that this might actually work. Clara felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. She stood near the window in the dove-grey dress, still carrying the reticule she had held close since they left the ship. She stepped forward. "If I may, Marshal Harding," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying across the room without effort. "My husband's claim to my family's assets is based on standard marital property law. Under ordinary circumstances, he would be correct. A husband does hold authority over his wife's property upon marriage." Marcus turned to her with a look of momentary relief, as though she were about to confirm his argument and save him.
These are not ordinary circumstances, Clara continued.
She opened her reticule and produced a folded document, heavy parchment, sealed with wax, bearing the stamp of the county registrar's office.
This is a certified copy of the amended marriage settlement signed during the wedding registry at Crestwood Manor. Under its terms, all Thornton family assets, the trade charters, the Devon estate, the dry dock holdings, were placed into a protected merchant trust entirely separate from marital property. My husband signed these terms himself. She laid the document on the green baize table. The clerk leaned forward. Hargreaves reached for his spectacles. Marcus stared at the parchment.
I signed nothing of the sort.
You signed the registry, Clara said. The amended terms were incorporated into the settlement documents presented alongside it. You were, if I recall, in rather a hurry to complete the formalities that morning.
The color that had slowly returned to Marcus's face over the past hour drained away again.
He looked at the document, then at Clara, then back at the document, as though switching between the two might change what was written on the page. Marshal Harding picked up the parchment and read it carefully. He passed it to Hargreaves. Hargreaves read it twice and set it down.
The trust is valid, Hargreaves said. The Thornton assets are legally separated from the Ashford estate. They cannot be used as collateral or pledged against any debt incurred by Duke Ashford.
Marcus gripped the edge of the table. This is fraud. She has deceived me. I demand.
There is one more matter, Clara said.
The room went still again. She reached into her reticule and produced a second document. A letter on thick cream paper, bearing the letterhead of the London Continental Banking Syndicate. This morning, before the Iron Sovereign entered the harbour, my representative completed a transaction with the syndicate's debt trading office. He purchased all of my husband's outstanding loan obligations at a discounted rate, as is standard practice for debts in active default. She placed the letter beside the first document. The purchaser was the Thornton Merchant Trust, which means that as of 8 o'clock this morning, every penny my husband owes the syndicate is now owed to me. Marcus's mouth opened. No sound came out. Clara looked at him across the green baize table. This man who had destroyed her family's ships, bankrupted her father, and married her like a prize he had won at auction. She held his gaze and did not look away. You took everything from my family, Marcus. Our ships, our trade, our name. You thought I was a frightened girl with no choices left. She paused. I want you to understand something. Every choice I have made since the moment I overheard you in that study has led to this room. I am not your wife in any way that benefits you. I am your creditor, and I am here to collect. Marcus sank into the nearest chair. His hands lay flat on the table, and for the first time, they were the ones trembling. The clerk's quill began to move again, recording everything. Clara gathered her documents, closed her reticule, and walked out of the harbor master's office into the afternoon sun. The harbor stretched out before her, wide, bright, and full of ships. Somewhere among them, her family's future was waiting.